Good evening. I am Krista Johnson, political science major and co-chair of the Committee on Lectures, funded by the government of the student body, and I would like to welcome you all to the panel tonight. We are honored to host this event as a part of our lecture series that includes more than 130 speakers every year, including the World Food Prize laureates who spoke earlier this week. Additionally, on Monday, we will be hosting crisis manager Judy Smith, whose career is the basis for the ABC show Scandal, and on the following Monday, the long-awaited writer Bill Bryson. Before I introduce our moderator, I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the First Amendment Days, the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication, History, Philosophy and Religious Studies, Political Science, and the University Library. And now, our moderator, who is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science here at Iowa State. He was a congressional fellow in Congressman Lee Hamilton's office. He has authored and edited 12 books, including American Foreign Policy and Process and The Domestic Sources of American Foreign Policy. He has also published more than 70 book chapters and journal articles, and he is the recipient of numerous awards. However, we political science majors believe that his greatest accomplishments are in the classroom. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for the evening, Dr. James McCormick.
Hey! Thank you very much, Krista, for that kind introduction. I'd like to also add my welcome to everyone here tonight. What a wonderful audience for this very kind of historic event here. For me, this panel and topic are not only a sort of a history lesson about the congressional role in the impeachment process, but as you can tell from my hair here, this is also a trip down memory lane for me, since I watched intently the Watergate hearings in the summer of 1973, and then the impeachment process a year later. We're going to start this evening by having a short video documentary entitled Reflections on Watergate. It's about 10 minutes long, and then we'll proceed to introduce the panel and have our discussion. So we'll go ahead with the video right now.
Good evening. It was almost 2 years ago, in June 1972, that 5 men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington. It turned out that they were connected with my re-election committee, and the Watergate break-in became a major issue in the campaign. The basic question at issue today is whether the president personally acted improperly in the Watergate matter.
Well, when you grow up in Iowa, which I did, and I was the son of immigrants, we prided ourselves in our country. You know, we were proud of our country, proud of our president. We may not have agreed with everything the president said. So that's what I grew up with. I grew up with that in Ames. We listened to the presidents on the radio then, not as much television. And it gave us a sense of pride. Then that period, I go to Congress, and just because I was a different party from Nixon, and I had met Nixon at the White House when we got sworn in, it wasn't enough just because we differed with him on policy or certain issues to vote for the impeachment. So that's really what I walked into.
When I was elected in November in the general election, I had to decide what committees I wanted to be on, and I decided I did not want to be on the House Judiciary Committee. Of course, not knowing that it would be in the middle of history when it would have to take up the impeachment of Richard Nixon. Of course, if anybody had the slightest inkling that there would be an impeachment inquiry, you know I would never have been put on the House Judiciary Committee. I was a brand new member, I had no clout, and there's no way that the leadership would have ever given me such a plum assignment.
There have been allegations, insinuations, that I knew about the planning of the Watergate break-in and that I was involved in an extensive plot to cover it up. The House Judiciary Committee is now investigating these charges.
From our perspective and from the committee's role, it was a combination of putting the presidency on trial. we had to decide whether or not under our Constitution this one check of the abuse of power, whether this one check that the framers of our Constitution laid out, which they never expected probably to ever happen, whether that check was in play. What we didn't realize, at the same time the presidency was on trial, the Congress was on trial, because the Congress had to make a decision which was momentous, which affected the country.
The stakes were very high. If we wanted to have justice done, we couldn't be seen to be acting in a partisan way. So the effort was very serious and sincere. The House Judiciary Committee went out of its way to act in as much a nonpartisan way as possible, because we did not want any questions to be asked about were we being unfair to Richard Nixon. So we wanted to do whatever we did correctly.
Ever since the existence of the White House taping system was first made known last summer, I have tried vigorously to guard the privacy of the tapes. I've been well aware that my effort to protect the confidentiality of presidential conversations has heightened the sense of mystery about Watergate, and in fact has caused increased suspicions of the president. Many people assume that the tapes must incriminate the president, or that otherwise he wouldn't insist on their privacy.
We had no idea that there would be tapes that we would listen to, and the impact of those tapes, which probably no president now is ever going to have in the White House, again, really was the crushing blow. And when I heard the tapes and had to make that decision, that's really what was a major factor in terms of ultimately deciding the vote.
No one in the White House was involved. I want there to be no question remaining about the fact that the president has nothing to hide.
He wasn't able to admit his mistakes. If he would have been able to have gone before the camera and said, look, I'm sorry, events happened that were not right, it was wrong, and I was wrong, and I asked the American public for forgiveness, and I still want to be your president. I think our public is a forgiving kind of public, and the voter would have accepted that, and I think it would have been very difficult to proceed. I think that argument would have been hard. He could have acknowledged what happened, and I think it would have been taken on its face and perhaps would have changed the ultimate outcome. The only other emotional moment that came to me was that I felt sad. When we had to vote, it was very emotional because I didn't want to impeach a president. I didn't want to remove a president. I didn't want to acknowledge the abuse of office.
Mr. Flowers.
Aye.
Mr. Sarbanes.
Aye.
Mr. Railsback.
Aye.
Ms. Holtzman.
Aye.
Nobody took any pleasure in that vote. I didn't agree with many of the things that Richard Nixon stood for, but I hated having to cast that vote because he was my president, and I did not want to see a president of the United States engage in that conduct. But I knew I had no choice. I knew I had a responsibility under the Constitution to hold him accountable.
Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Mr. Rodino.
Aye.
Mr. Conyers.
Aye.
Mr. Mezvinsky.
Aye.
And we talked among ourselves, including the Barbara Jordan and the other people and the Chairman Rodino, that it was a sad moment, but yet it was probably one of the finest hours for Congress, later we discovered.
When we voted for the impeachment of Richard Nixon, I don't recall that any poll had been taken. So nobody exactly knew what the consequences of this were going to be. We just did what the evidence and the Constitution and the law told us was the right thing to do.
And then when Nixon had to he made his resignation speech in the White House, and he talked about it, and I was then driving to the Hill. This was after the hearings and everything. I literally pulled off the road and cried because I felt what it did to our country, but yet on the other hand, it was, as I indicated, Congress on trial. It was the test, and it probably, as I said, came out to perhaps be one of the finest hours.
The impeachment of the president is a remedy of last resort. It is the most solemn act of our entire constitutional process. The impact of such an ordeal would be felt throughout the world, and it would have its effect on the lives of all Americans for many years to come.
There were many people who said the country can't withstand an impeachment, that this would be tear the country apart, that we could never do this, it would be terrible. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that Americans are pretty strong people. And our country's a pretty strong country. And no, the country did not collapse in the face of the impeachment effort. In fact, I think it became stronger because Americans discovered that in the end we all shared the same value, or most of us, overwhelming majority, shared the value that more important than a president, a party, was the Constitution and the rule of law, that we were a democracy. So if a president did something wrong and this was the procedure, then the procedure was going to be followed. Here we are 40 years later, and no one's really seriously attacked the process under which the committee acted or the results of the impeachment process.
The papers should be available for the public and for the researchers to sort of know what we went through, the history of this. Also maybe as a lesson as to perhaps how government can run, whether you're a partisan on one side or the other, that there comes a time when, you know, the country, you have to face issues and you have to come together as a people to deal with volatile issues, yes, that are emotional, but yet you expect your government and your representatives to sort of to be able to do that, to take those positions. So it really showed that the institutions of government can work and what the founders really intended to do. So I hope the papers will bring out perhaps what can be done rather than what we're witnessing perhaps on the front pages and on television today.
I have to follow that. The way we'll proceed this evening is I'm going to introduce all the panelists first. You've met two-thirds of them already in the video. And then we're going to ask them to speak for about 10 minutes and then open up the process for questions and answers with the audience here. I want to first introduce Elizabeth Holtzman from New York City. She is the former member of Congress from 1973 to 1981, and as you saw, she served on the Judiciary Committee during the Watergate period. Ms. Holtzman is a native of Brooklyn, New York, and she has served as District Attorney for Kings County, New York, or Brooklyn, and as the New York City Controller. Welcome, and we're delighted to have you here in Iowa. Our second speaker is Edward Wisniewski. He's a native of Ames, former congressman representing the 1st District of Iowa in Congress from 1973 to 1977. He also, as you saw, served on the House Judiciary Committee during the Watergate period and was involved in the impeachment process. Just this afternoon, Ed turned over his Watergate-related papers to the ISU library, as well as a number of his campaign memorabilia, and so on. And they will be on display in the special collections until March of next year. And welcome back to to Ames here, Ed. And thank you very much for the papers. Our third speaker, third member of the panel here tonight is Jonathan Yarorsky. He's currently attorney with Wilmer Hale Law Firm in Washington, D.C., but he has had a distinguished career in serving in several senior-level government positions. These include special counsel to former President Clinton, general counsel of the House Committee on the Judiciary, and chief counsel of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Economic and Commercial Law. With these appointments, as you can see, and I can just add, he was on the Judiciary Committee during the Watergate period. Welcome to Ames and to Iowa State.
Thank you.
I might just add a fourth member of our panel, Nick Kotz, was not able to be with us this evening. His wife suffered a fall and he was unable to travel to Iowa. I was asked, and I don't know if the panelists will all do this, but I was asked to formulate a couple questions to kind of get the discussion going. And so I'll throw these out, and hopefully they'll be answered in the course of the discussion. I'd like to know what each of these panelists' most vivid memory of the Watergate hearings and the process as it related to the politics and the political process. Secondly, I'd like to know what are one or two lessons that Americans should learn from this Watergate experience, and is there any evidence that we have learned these lessons since the Watergate days? So let me start by asking Elizabeth Holzman to present her thoughts.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the warm welcome here in Iowa. And thanks so much to you, Ed, for the honor of appearing here today with you. It was a great privilege to serve on the House Judiciary Committee and a great honor to know Ed and to work with him. And of course, this is a wonderful day for the university, too, because he's donated his papers, including the papers about the impeachment, which I certainly know will be of an inestimable value to students and scholars now and in the future. I'm going to focus my comments on the second question, the lessons that we've learned or should have learned from Watergate. And normally I don't write out a speech, but I want to make sure that I got most of my thoughts in here, so you'll bear with me, please, I hope. Watergate, in a very different context, as has been said, it was the worst of times and it was the best of times. The country saw its duly elected president, Richard Milhous Nixon, exposed for widespread violations of the law and abuses of power. Yet the country also saw the president resign his office because the other institutions of government, the U.S. House of Representatives, the Senate, and the courts, as well as the press and the American people, stood up for the rule of law. I just want to review some of the facts because I know that at least one or two people in this room wasn't around, really, at the time of Watergate. So I think it's really important to kind of get that kind of grounding, so you'll forgive me. On June 17, 1972, operatives working for President Nixon's re-election campaign broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., that's why it's called Watergate, and installed bugging equipment. While the burglars' objectives remain unknown to this day, they were clearly intending to subvert the presidential election slated for that November. This is June, election in November. Spotting their activities, an alert security guard called the police. The burglars were arrested and caught with cash traceable to the Nixon re-elect campaign and an address book that listed a White House employee. Because the arrests could have exposed Nixon's campaign role in a serious crime, burglary, and threatened Nixon's re-election, a large-scale, presidentially orchestrated cover-up swung into high gear. White House lobbying blocked a House committee committee's effort to subpoena information about the cash. The White House enlisted the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation. Promises of presidential pardons and payments of hush money received as illegal contributions by the Nixon campaign bought the burglars' silence. The president himself obtained secret grand jury information and passed it on to prospective witnesses. The cover-up worked. Soon, the headlines generated by the initial arrests of the burglars faded from notice, and President Nixon won his November re-election in one of the largest landslides in the history of the United States. Within 2 months of the election, however, the cover-up began to unravel. Slowly but surely, the facts started tumbling out. What the White House had characterized as a third-rate burglary turned out to be part and parcel of a pattern of serious crimes and abuses of power ordered or condoned by the President of the United States himself and throughout his presidency. Watergate became the catch-all term used to describe this whole series of varied crimes and abuses. The best known, obviously, of these misdeeds was the cover-up itself, which was a federal crime, obstruction of justice, and which was a mosaic of many, many other crimes, some of which I've previously mentioned. But Watergate included other crimes as well. For example, the White House authorized a break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to get material to smear him with. There was also a plumber's unit to engage in surveillance created and housed in the White House itself. President Nixon also authorized the illegal wiretapping of journalists and White House staffers. And there were serious abuses of power. President Nixon directed a so-called enemies list be created of Americans who opposed his Vietnam War policies. These enemies were to be subjected to harassing IRS audits simply because of their political views. Nixon also ordered the secret bombing of Cambodia without congressional approval. 2 sets of books were kept about the bombing, and Congress as a whole was never told. The 40th anniversary of the Watergate break-in presents a good opportunity to evaluate the legacy it left. From the perspective of 40 years, it is clear that the Constitution's system of checks and balances worked in Watergate. The framers of the Constitution clearly understood that a president could commit crimes and engage in serious misconduct in office. That is why they inserted the impeachment clause in the Constitution, which allows the removal of president for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. They knew that a president could represent such a danger to our democracy that the country couldn't wait until the next election to oust him from office. But interestingly enough, it was the courts that first responded effectively to the Watergate situation. Federal Judge John Sirica, a conservative Republican, had been assigned the break-in case. Smelling something fishy, he imposed very tough sentences on the burglars, hoping that one would cave in and tell the truth about what happened. One did, and admitted there were higher-ups involved. Then the Congress snapped smartly into its proper role once the existence of higher-ups in the break-in had been disclosed, after caving in to a lobbying effort to stop an investigation before. First, the Senate ensured that there would be a thorough investigation of the break-in by insisting that the newly named Attorney General appoint an independent special prosecutor. After all, a Justice Department under the thumb of the White House couldn't really be expected to do a thorough and honest job of investigating the White House. So the Senate said to the newly named Attorney General, if you want to be confirmed, you have to agree to appoint an independent special prosecutor. And that was done. Archibald Cox, a distinguished Harvard law professor, was named as a special prosecutor, removable only for cause. Second, the Senate then held special hearings into Watergate. John Dean, the former White House counsel to Nixon, testified that there was a cover-up and that he had warned the president the cover-up was a cancer on the presidency. Another White House staffer revealed the existence of a presidential taping system in the Oval Office. The tapes would be the best evidence of whether Dean was right and the president himself was involved in the cover-up. Naturally, given the importance of the tapes, the special prosecutor subpoenaed them. President Nixon's fate was sealed when he tried to stop the special prosecutor from getting his Oval Office tapes, ordering him fired. But Nixon did not count on resistance to that order. Neither the Attorney General nor his deputy would fire Cox, resigning their office instead. The third in line in the Justice Department fired Cox, and this series of events became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The American people rose up against the shoddy spectacle of a president who was trying to block an investigation into his own possible crimes and called for action. This prompted the House Judiciary Committee to commence an impeachment inquiry against President Nixon. The committee's work was finished when it voted 3 articles of impeachment on a bipartisan basis in July 1974. The first article spelled out acts that amounted to an obstruction of justice, the second an abuse of power, and the third dealt with Nixon's obstruction of the work of the Judiciary Committee itself. The Supreme Court of the United States put the finishing touches on the whole matter by unanimously ruling that President Nixon had to turn over his Oval Office tapes to the special prosecutor and the grand jury, despite the fact that several of these judges had been appointed by President Nixon himself. All the judges determined that the effective enforcement of the laws and the need for criminal accountability trumped presidential prerogatives. Nixon, not daring to defy the Supreme Court of the United States, released the tapes, including the famous smoking gun tape, that showed Nixon ordering the cover-up himself. Once the tape became public, all the holdout Republicans on the Judiciary Committee joined the other members in supporting impeachment, and it was now certain that the whole House would vote for the impeachment of Richard Nixon and the Senate would vote to convict him by a 2/3 vote. Within days, Richard Nixon resigned, becoming the first president in the history of the United States to do so. In my opinion, the rule of law prevailed. The constitutional system worked according to blueprint. A president who put himself above the law was reined in both by the Congress, by both houses of Congress, on a bipartisan basis, and the courts. As important, the American people recognized that they shared the basic value that no president was more important than the rule of law. In the end, Watergate was about accountability for presidential wrongdoing. Nixon was exposed, the record of his misdeeds was fully made and presented to the American people. His top aides and dozens of others in his administration went to prison for their misdeeds and his, and Nixon himself was named an unindicted co-conspirator by the grand jury in the cover-up criminal case. Even the presidential pardon by Gerald Ford that prevented any prosecution of Nixon did not blot out the record of his wrongdoing. Nixon's disgrace and his misconduct are indelible historical facts. But since then, the legacy of accountability, which was the centerpiece of the response to Watergate, seems to have been just evaporating. I just want to take, I could give you a number of examples, but I'm just going to take the abuses of power that occurred during the Bush administration. For example, even though President Bush acknowledged authorizing waterboarding, an act that usually is viewed as torture, no investigation has been conducted of his possible violation of the Federal Anti-Torture Act, which is a felony. Even though President Bush publicly acknowledged ordering wiretapping of Americans without a court order, in apparent violation of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, a felony, no criminal investigation has taken place. And no investigation has ever taken place into the origins of the invasion of Iraq, even though there are questions as to whether acts in connection with that may also violate U.S. law. I'm not saying they do, but they raise the question. Instead of accountability, our government, our country, seems to embrace the idea of impunity. Presidents, it seems, are just too iconic to be held to the standard of obeying the law, something applicable to the most of the rest of us, but not to the most powerful in the land. It's also worth noting that many of the reforms adopted in the wake of Watergate have been weakened or allowed to lapse. Campaign finance reform was prompted by the cash contributions to the Nixon campaign that were used to bribe the burglars for their silence. But the reform laws have been gutted by various Supreme Court decisions, including Citizens United, and by lax Federal Elections Commission enforcement. Nixon's illegal wiretapping was one of the key inspirations for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was designed to prevent executive action, unilateral executive action in wiretapping. You needed a court order. Nixon kept claiming that national security reasons justified his illegal surveillance and the break-ins, but that was simply not true. The law that was enacted to respond to the illegal surveillance and the illegal wiretapping has been largely defanged. And now we see the consequences. We have widespread surveillance, and we're just beginning to understand the scope of it. The special prosecutor law that was enacted because Congress understood that presidents would not investigate themselves, no surprise, and that there needed to be a mechanism to ensure such investigations would be conducted, appears to have has been allowed to lapse. The law designed to ensure there would be no impunity for presidents is no longer in existence. There is no mechanism to ensure an independent investigation if there are grounds to believe, reasonable grounds to believe, that a president or other highest officials in the land have committed crimes. And the War Powers Act, which was a direct response to the disclosure about President Nixon's secret bombing of Cambodia and the need to have congressional input into war-making decisions, has been largely pushed aside and ignored. So, after 40 years, we appear to have forgotten the critical lessons of Watergate, and if anything, are less prepared to deal with executive branch excesses than before. It is a sobering lesson for us. There's another lesson in light of recent events in which a minority of right-wing ideologues in the House and Senate were ready to shut the government down and cause it to default on its debts, with potentially catastrophic consequences for our economy and that of the entire world. As I have shown in Watergate, members of the House and Senate broke out of their partisan mold and did what they knew was right for the country. It took enormous courage for Southern Democrats and Republicans on the Judiciary Committee to vote for impeachment. After all, Nixon had carried their districts by huge margins just months before. But they were ready to risk losing their seats to protect the rule of law. Stop to think about that. The chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Peter Rodino, also understood that the country would never support impeachment if it were voted on a partisan basis. The outcome of an election was not going to be switched by a rabid congressional majority, no matter which party was in charge. He understood that. And so he bent over backwards to make sure that the procedures were fair to President Nixon, and he brought the Republicans into the decision-making on the charges that were ultimately voted. How have we so lost the idea that the country comes first? How has it come about that the parties have so demonized each other that they can't work together? Watergate was a political and constitutional crisis. The country weathered it because even though the president did wrong, the people in Congress and the courts who had to respond to him, for the most part, did what they believed was right and acted out of conscience and principle. The question that confronts us is, was that a unique moment in our history? Or can we recapture it again? Thank you.
Well, it's great to be back in Ames. As Jim pointed out, I was born and raised in Ames, developed a value system in Iowa. The value system, little did I know at the time, and as Liz pointed out when you watched the video, little did we know that we would be tested in our value system when we had to look at and assess whether or not a president should be removed from office. It was alien for me, growing up in the Midwest. Those of you who are students here know that you don't just look lightly upon removing a president. I grew up, yes, in Ames, and I was elected at the same time that Watergate was breaking. It was breaking in the summer of '72. That was when Richard Nixon was running against George McGovern. And it was viewed as pretty much a hopeless race for George McGovern. And I was running for Congress, and really the reason that I happen to be sitting here tonight was because of students, of university, of a concern about which way the country was going. We were concerned about Vietnam. Vietnam was on the plate, front and center, like Iraq, like Afghanistan, like the conflicts of the drones that we see today. It was Vietnam. It was boys going to war. Women were not being drafted at the time, but young men were going to war. They were drafted, and there was protests. And so, in the midst of my race, there were students. At this time, I was running in Johnson County in Iowa City, and the students were involved. And they were concerned about what was happening with the country. There was protest. They were overtly out in front. They weren't passive. They were concerned. And as a result of that, here I am in Ames 40 years later, to a great extent because of the kind of student body and the kind of organization that I see here. So many of you here concerned about, yes, the lessons of Watergate, but obviously concerned about which way the country was going. And then you may be interested to know, well, how do you get on the Judiciary Committee? In those days, you had to have the blessing of a chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and some of us flew down to Little Rock, Arkansas. It wasn't Bill Clinton's Arkansas at that time. It was a person by the name of Wilbur Mills, and I went in to plead my case to get on the Judiciary Committee. I was trained as a lawyer, and I felt I was concerned about which way the country was going. And here in an agricultural state, I was concerned that large farms were getting larger, and the small farmer was having a difficult time. And I was concerned about the issue of antitrust, of the big guys at the top controlling what was going on in this country. And so I made the plea to get on the Judiciary Committee, and I was told at that time, well, I don't know if you'll get on because the past president called, and there was a candidate from Houston, from Texas. Her name was Barbara Jordan, a wonderful woman who did get on the Judiciary Committee. And then I was able to get on with Liz Holtzman, and little did we know, when Spiro Agnew, the vice president, got in trouble and was removed, under the Constitution, we had to decide what was going to be done with the next vice president. And there was a congressman from Detroit. His name was John Conyers. And there was a father priest by the name of Robert Drinan from Massachusetts. And we all went into a caucus. Liz will remember this. And we had to decide. President Nixon nominated Gerald Ford, the same person that later became president that ended up pardoning Nixon. And he nominated President Ford, and some of the members stood up in the caucus and said, "Look, Ed, we can't support the nominee because President Nixon is going to be removed from office." And here I am, this naive Midwesterner, not as sophisticated, wondering, well, what do you mean? What makes you think that Nixon is going to be removed from office just because his vice president gets in trouble? And that was the start, and as Elizabeth Holtzman pointed out, we had what we called the Saturday Night Massacre, when Archibald Cox was asked to leave as special prosecutor, and that started the ball rolling. And the first resolution introduced by that John Conyers and Robert Drinan that started the whole road toward looking at impeachment, that was the process that began. And I just want you to know, as I was thinking about what to say about the experience and what it did for me, yes, I grew up, as pointed out, I grew up believing in a president. Yeah, I felt strongly about issues. I felt that they were important. I was raised here, but I was raised to look at issues intellectually on an academic level and the substance. And I said, well, just because I differ with a president, that is not enough to remove that person from office. And that's what I walked into the committee. And I walked into that thinking about that. But at the same time, we were on trial. Not only was the president on trial, but the Congress was on trial. The same way that you look at Congress today, where the rating is very low, but the public was concerned what was happening. And impeachment, yes, it's a legal position. There's a constitutional standard of high crimes and misdemeanors, and if you violate those standards, that you're subject to, like the Judiciary Committee becomes like a grand jury, and if there's reasonable doubt, you will recommend the impeachment and it will go to the Senate to vote and to commit. And that's really what we were dealing with when we were walking into this process. And the process went on, and just imagine yourself being thrust into that environment, not anticipating that you would have to weigh it, but yet realizing that you're in conflict. You're in conflict that this is the president of this country, one that we look up to, one that we hope sets the standard of what is right in this country, and doesn't abuse the office, doesn't live on the edge, and is not above the law, the same as every student in this room, every person in this room, ourselves included. We are not above the law, including the President of the United States. And so with that standard, that's what we committee members had to listen to. We listened to testimony, we heard the tapes, which the President, little did he know, would have to be revealed ultimately by the Supreme Court's action, as Liz pointed out. And we listened to those tapes. And let me tell you what it did to me with the experience of growing up in the Midwest. I heard those tapes, and I became enraged. I became enraged how people were not thinking about our country. They were thinking about public relations. They were thinking about how do they survive, or how do we cover this up, or let's find a way to get around it. And then we heard the tapes of the president, who didn't want to reveal the conversations, forced by a Supreme Court decision to open up those tapes, which we heard. We heard them privately. We heard them in the confines of our committee room in executive session. It's part of the papers that technically are not yet available. We heard that, and it affected my thoughts. It affected, yes, Liz Holtzman pointed out, not only Democrats, but also Republicans that said, wait a minute, this isn't what our president's supposed to be doing. This is not the office. We should not abuse the office. We should allow this president to answer, but he has to respect the rule of law. And that process continued. We listened to it, the courts ruled, and as it went on, I became emotionally up and down. Emotionally saddened. Emotionally depressed. What I heard. This is our country. This is our leaders. And this is in the best interests of our country, irrespective of party. And different than today, which I'll point out on the lessons, that we looked at this in a way that was bipartisan. So yes, there were 21 Democrats and 17 Republicans. But when we listened to the tapes and when it came out in the open, there were not just the Democrats, and there were the Southern Democrats that were heated, that had the South on them, that said, no, we can never impeach a president. This country can't stand it. It will fall apart. It will bring this country down to remove a president. And there were demonstrations in the streets by groups that didn't want to have that to happen. We can't afford that. It was too much. And I would come home to my district. And before, when I was elected, Mizvinsky is not an easy name. It's not a household name when we started, and we had a spot where people mispronounced the name. And so I knew when I campaigned, people would laugh because they could mispronounce it, and that's how we got elected, and it was a different time. When I came back during impeachment, they weren't just smiling. Some people were throwing stones. They were angry. You can't remove this president. Don't do it. That is what impeachment is, as well as fact. It's a legal position, but it's also political, because you saw the public move as time went on, as the revelations came out. You saw that developing, and the movement changed, and it affected those that had the courage, those from the South, the Walter Fowlers, the James Mann. They had the courage to say, wait a minute, okay, my constituency doesn't understand this, but this is wrong. And there were Republicans, the one across the river from mine, Tom Railsback from Rock Island and Moline, Bill Cohen from Massachusetts, Hamilton Fish. There were those, even Hogan, who was an FBI agent. They said, wait, this is too much. We have to face reality. Unfortunately, we have to remove, and we have to vote to impeach a president. And when the Supreme Court acted, that was the water that broke the dam, and consequently, the president was told by members of his own party. They went to the White House. Barry Goldwater, who later became a nominee, Barry Goldwater and others, including Hugh Scott from Pennsylvania, said, look, it's over, Mr. President, and he resigned. The emotional part was, as I pointed out on that tape, I cried. I cried because I did not want my president to be removed and to act in the manner in which he acted. But we faced in the Liz Holtzmans of the world who were strong and who raised the issues, and I raised the tax issue. Nixon paid $700 tax. Remember this last campaign we had where people were fighting over taxes? He paid $700 tax, and then he paid $800 taxes because he backdated a deed for $500,000. I sponsored an article of that, but we had already impeached him 3 times. So you can't, add, let's don't overdo it. And then we had Father Drinan, who felt He didn't have the war power to drop bombs on Cambodia and napalm people and young boys and girls. And that was another article of impeachment. So that's the lesson that we learned. And now, my impact is this. What have we learned, really? And I'll just be succinct because we have John to speak and so much time, is the lessons, it's hard to see where the lessons have learned. Money in politics, yes. Money was under the table in those days. It was under the table. They bought ambassadorships with $1 million. If you spend $1 million, maybe you'll get the Dominican Republic, but you won't get France or you won't get Britain. Now money is above the table. And that's part of the difference. Taxes, do you remember just a few months ago, people were concerned about whether or not the IRS was being used, whether Big Brother was on the table. So my comment, basically to bring it to a close in terms of the lesson, is we have to reestablish the trust in government. We're losing the trust. We've just gone through a shutdown. We've lost billions of dollars of damage to our economy. The impact has been significant. People are cynical. And so we hope that what Liz pointed out, it was probably Congress's finest hour in many ways. And now we have to face reality of how can we come out of that lesson and learn from the past and be positive about where we're going to go in the future.
Hi, I'm John Urowski, and I was probably one of those students that Ed was describing, demonstrating at the time that he chose to run for office. I actually came to Iowa to help on that campaign. It was a big moment for me in my college career. But Ed set the stage, and I need to go back a little bit because there was such a heightened awareness of the political landscape. I mean, it was a very heightened period culturally. Ed and Elizabeth have referred to it. But Watergate took place in the amphitheater of intense cultural feelings. The music, yeah, it was better than now. Much better. But there was a cultural clash. Vietnam obviously was at the core, as Ed mentioned, but there was a really great generational divide, great cultural divide. It was exciting at one level if you were 18 to 21 years old, but it probably was frightening to many people because it seemed like the value systems were kind of falling apart or just being pulled apart. And that, as Elizabeth has now wonderfully described the chronology of events, against that larger cultural backdrop, this volcanic political event occurred. And I can tell you, I was on campus, you're on campus, and a lot of folks think that college students really don't pay attention to the larger world because there's so much going on in their lives, and that's true. But everybody was paying attention to this. Everybody was reading the paper. Everybody was watching TV. There wasn't multimedia. So there was, you had to find a TV screen, but people did. And what they began to see was, and I think your first question was, what was interesting or memorable about the political process? And again, not being very savvy about political processes, what I observed was a hesitancy. You both have described the hesitancy you had in moving forward very slowly at every step because of the momentous decision that it seemed to be taking you on. But there was a different kind of interpersonal interaction with the members. And in a sense, I'm kind of the next generation of people that dealt with the House Judiciary Committee. I was on the House Judiciary Committee for 12 years, but I came in the mid-'80s. So what I had to watch were a number of the members that you saw on that screen were still there. And so they were living embodiments of having witnessed that event, but then having to move forward in time. The chairman, who you saw very little of, but enough, and you've heard both of these amazing members of that committee talk about him, Peter Rodino, he was still the chairman. Okay, and you know, it's not necessarily a name you all know very well, but he shaped, you know, really the future and history of that committee. I mean, to be a singular force and a writing force for the Congress. And Ed and Elizabeth talks about her hesitation on getting on the committee, and Ed talks about flying to Arkansas. A lot of people went to other committees where there were higher financial contributions. The Judiciary Committee is not a committee where you're going to get an unbelievable amount of financial contributions, because the issues you deal with are things like constitutional law, civil rights, antitrust law, fighting monopolies, and things like that. So people who end up on that committee end up making large decisions. This was a momentous decision. But now flash forward to Peter Rodino, the chairman, who navigated this whole process. In fact, there was a lot of debate from what I heard later in time and what I even read among the members. And we're in a school, so I'm not talking out of school. But there was a real debate about whether the chairman of the Judiciary Committee moved fast enough to reach the final result once things were known. And I think he moved at a speed that he knew would reflect the level of seriousness in making these decisions. Nothing had changed when I arrived on the committee. Years later, mid-'80s. Okay, so that's what, 13 or 14 years later. What Peter Rodino was, as I got to know him better, what Peter Rodino grappled with a lot in his mind was kind of an amazing intellectual concept. I mean, people don't think of Peter Rodino as an intellectual. Brilliant man, but not as an intellectual. What he really wondered a lot about was this. Was Watergate sui generis such a unique event that it would never occur again, and that the lessons learned would ensure that it would never occur again? Or was there in politics something like the notion of eternal recurrence? Okay? Big words, right? But this was a big philosophical debate in the late 1800s about life itself. Are we just replaying eternally the same drama over and over again with just different players? And Peter Rodino may not have read those books, but what he was wondering as he watched the 80s unfold was that are we now kind of slipping back? And why was that? Was because there was another event that occurred, not of this dimension, but I would say pretty important, and that was called the Iran-Contra scandal. Many of the same characteristics that Elizabeth so brilliantly detailed, just laid threadbare lucidly for all of us, there were the elements of Watergate. If you just jump forward, 15 years, they were all there. I'm not going to go through them. But, you know, and it was out of central casting with Oliver North, you know, and just an array of characters. You always have rogue characters, and that makes things very interesting. But there were plenty of rogue characters in that play, too. But Rodino had to deal with that as well. Not singularly, because they formed a joint committee. But Judiciary was very much involved. There was Foreign Relations was also involved, because it was about Iran and Nicaragua and things like that. But it really worried him that we were on the verge of repeating ourselves. So the question that I will pose for you, because we are going to run out of time of prepared remarks, is this. Watergate for me as a 19-year-old student was what it was as an event, but it also was what it meant to me. What I mean by, and I don't mean to be vain or narcissistic by that it's about me, but when things happen in the body politic, it is also about you and your reaction, and you need to watch your reaction, because if you learn from that, you will help shape the political culture. That culture is under threat now. And until the larger body politic expresses its view to folks now in Congress, and I don't mean that as a partisan comment, until that happens, you will not have change to right the boat that I think most of us are worried about. So what I hope is that this retrospective on Watergate will have maybe more meaning now for you so that you can ponder it. And then, because of that, plug into the system. Iowa is number one in kind of creating the next election, so think about that. But also think about the question, lessons learned. What lessons do you think you should carry forth and contribute to society? That is not just a general admonition. It really is a very personal plea and a personal thing that I, and I think all of us up here, ask ourselves every day. Why don't I stop there, and we'll go from there.
We want to turn to some questions now for a few moments here. There are microphones on each side here, and I'd ask you to line up. But could I ask you to really thank our panel once more for what great comments. Please, if you have questions, avail yourselves of the microphones. Please make your question short and to the point, and we'll answer as many as we can.
Absolutely. This is for Mr. Mezvinsky and Ms. Holtzman. You guys didn't really mention a whole lot about the press and journalists during the time. Do you feel that Watergate would have been exposed like it was without the press? Ladies first.
Well, you don't get to choose that.
All right.
The lady does. Mr. Mezvinsky, do you want to talk about it? Or no?
Yeah,
I'm just trying to remember. First of all, I did mention the press. They played an extraordinary role. And by the way, it was two young reporters. Maybe they didn't know what they were getting into, just like Ed and I didn't know what we were getting into when we got into the House Judiciary Committee. They were dealing with a third-rate burglary. They had no idea they were dealing with the President of the United States. So they did extraordinary work. But I'm just trying to think. Remember, despite what they had done, the cover-up took place. And it was not their doing as much as Judge Sirica. Here's again, a conservative Republican, but doing what he knew had to be done under those circumstances. There was something fishy, he was going to act. So Woodward and Bernstein did a fantastic job, raised a lot of questions. The cover-up took place, big blanket over everything. Nixon wins his re-election. Quiet. We go on Judiciary Committee. They put us on Judiciary Committee. They have no clue there's anything happening here. The president's involved in anything. So the cover-up was a success. And who knows how long that would have lasted. But Sirica, it was a judge whose actions broke it open. Afterwards, after that, yes, of course. Then various press people were involved. But the cover-up was a success, despite the work of the press. But I don't mean in any way to diminish it, because without the press constantly nagging, nudging, working, doing whatever, pressing, who knows what else would have happened. But it was Sirica, and then the Saturday Night Massacre, and the American people. And you know, I don't mean to minimize the press, but that was the role I think they played.
My only additional comment would be that I mentioned in my initial remarks that I view impeachment beyond just the legal. There's it's a political process, because you've got members of Congress deciding who's going to be, whether or not a particular individual is going to be impeached. And it's clear that journalism, and there's a number of journalism students here, I know, but the press did move the process the same way that it affects public opinion. And so there were those, there were members that were maybe adamantly one way against it, But after a while, the public becomes educated. The press reveals information. That's good investigative reporting. And some of the best reporters, and maybe even today coming out of journalism schools, were attracted because of the investigative aspects. So my answer is, it moved the political process of impeachment because it developed public opinion. And you need public opinion to make the issue. And the bottom line is, impeachment is only successful if it really becomes bipartisan, if it becomes a partisan issue, and only one side takes the side. You won't be effective, and really what happened, it became bipartisan.
Hello. As we know, only 2 presidents have been impeached, and Nixon was not one of them. He said that he resigned because no president in the modern time could stand a trial in the Senate and all that time, and so he resigned. What is your perspective on the impeachment of Clinton? Things certainly seem to change.
Well, maybe I'll lead, then I'll... Okay. Yeah, the problem, the issue of President Clinton was that the ultimate, it points out the point I just made, it became a partisan issue. And also, what is an impeachable offense, which is a separate issue. And it's clear that the issues that were raised with Nixon and going back to others didn't rise to the level, though the Republicans felt, and it was one-sided, that President Clinton lied, and as a result of his testimony, that was enough to impeach him. But the bottom line is, to be effective, you cannot make it one-sided. It has to be bipartisan, and that's why Rodino, as John points out, handled it very nicely. He was slower. He let the process work its will, and members from both sides came around, and that was the difference. Whereas with President Clinton, and it just didn't get off the ground in terms of it being bipartisan. But Liz, I'll let you add.
Let me just add a few things. First of all, the trigger for the House Judiciary Committee's action was the American people's response to the Saturday Night Massacre. House Judiciary Committee, there were a number of members of the committee and some people in the House who, because of the revelations on the Senate side, and because of what happened in Sirica's courtroom, said we should start an inquiry. But the Rodino was not going to be moved, and the House leadership was not going to be moved. It was a stone, solid, granite wall. But when President Nixon fired the prosecutor who was investigating him, the American people said, no, we are not a banana republic. And that is what triggered the action. And I think if you compare it to the Clinton impeachment, and it sort of goes to some of what Ed was saying, there has to be public support. There has to be a public sense that what the president has done is of such gravity and is of such a threat to our democracy and such a threat to the rule of law that we can't wait another few years for him to be in power. Not that we don't like him, not that we don't agree with his policies, but that he's a threat to our democracy. That's really what it was about. And the impetus came from the public. Fast forward to Clinton. Where was the impetus for the impeachment? It was a report from the special prosecutor, a highly partisan person who was appointed and sent a report to the Judiciary Committee saying, I think there should be an impeachment. That's one person. That's not the American people. So that's number one difference. Second difference is, when I'm talking about the gravity, I mean, I don't think the public really, I'm not saying that all of us on the committee understood it either, but what's a high crime and misdemeanor? It's a very old British term, and not everybody understands fully what its meaning is, because you have to go into British legal history and the impeachments by the Parliament and all the rest of that. You don't want to know about it. We did. But in any case, basically, it involves a serious abuse of power and a subversion of the rule of law and of the democracy. You didn't have that, and it's abuse of the power of his office. President Clinton did a lot of bad things, but he didn't abuse the power of his office when he engaged in his dalliance with Monica Lewinsky. That was personal. It didn't use the powers of the presidency of the United States. So it's highly unlikely that it was an impeachable offense from a legal and constitutional point of view, but the public also didn't think that it was an impeachable offense. And so that's the big difference. It was triggered by a partisan prosecutor, and it was totally partisan. When we did, and just to give you an idea of how kind of fair our process was, Peter Rodino had to pick the chief counsel for the Democrats for the House Judiciary Committee. He picked a Republican. And the Republicans had to pick their chief counsel, and they picked a Republican. So the two chief counsels on the House Judiciary Committee were Republicans. Just stop to think about that. Because it was so serious, removing a president of the United States, undoing a democratic election, you don't do that lightly, that you had to bend over backwards to be fair, and that's what the difference was. And if Ed said if it's going to be partisan, the people won't buy it, nor should they.
Sir.
Yes, this goes to any one of you on the panel. I think that what we did in Watergate was legally one of our finest hours because we were able to follow the letter of the law and get to the bottom of it. What concerns me and really scares me is what was talked about during dinner. Now, we have a few people, 100 or 150 people with billions of dollars running this country. And how do we keep an eye on what they're doing? We could watch Nixon and see what he was doing. We caught the burglars. How do we know what these anonymous people with billions of dollars are doing?
Well, okay. The problem or lack thereof, but I think it is a huge problem, is based on, without getting too detailed, what the Supreme Court looked at in terms of the ability of an individual corporation to give money to make a political contribution. They dressed it all up in the First Amendment. Now, look, participation in the political process is your First Amendment right in many ways. Free speech, free association, that is First Amendment. And plugging into the political process absolutely is protected. And so the real question is, where do you draw the line? And once the Supreme Court ruled that, and there's more coming, there are more decisions like this coming, because the Supreme Court will come out with at least 2 more rulings about campaign finance that will do away, perhaps, with other limits that occur. When the Supreme Court bases its decision on a constitutional reason, not a statute, okay, so there's 2 different ways the court operates. If it's just a law that has not a constitutional provision, they can rule on that. If it's the constitutional provision, that's it. That's the end of the line. When the Supreme Court rules what's constitutional or not, that's it. There's no other appeal. So for the time being, but courts change, membership changes. So that's why when you hear this discussion, one of the things I did for President Clinton was help appoint judicial nominees to the bench. It's probably not my job, but the president's most important job in many ways, because who serves as a judge? That is the last, what they call, vestige of the king. What do I mean by that? Well, because the colonists wanted to, the revolutionaries wanted to destroy all vestiges of England, royalty, monarchy. So a lifetime appointment was really synonymous with that kind of British system back then, of a peerage or whatnot for life. It's not based on merit, it's life. So the founding fathers and mothers also decided that the one thing they had to do, that had to resemble that was to give a lifetime appointment to judges for purposes of judicial independence. Okay, so all of that makes sense. That's at the heart of our life, constitutional life. But that has consequences, right? And so when the court ruled that way, that's because of the nominees that were put forward, which are the right of the president to do. So who gets elected president is a very, very important decision. You don't hear campaign debates about judicial nominations, but it really matters who's sitting in the bench. And I think we're going to have to live with that decision for a long, long time. And I think there will be more concentrated power in fewer and fewer hands. The only way to dislodge that power, okay, because most of that is buying commercials, and buying airtime, is the power of people to plug into campaigns, okay, and really work for candidates and values and ideals they have. It's a very 18th century idea. You can defeat 21st technology and 21st century cash if you decide you want to walk and knock on a few doors. You will win. And that's all we can do, and then hope that the court then gets reconstituted in ways that may reflect a different value system. But that's the best way I can answer it. It's all about the judges.
We want to bring this to a close now, and I'd like to call to the podium Tony Campolo, who's a friend of Ed Mezvinsky here, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Eastern University and a former faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, for a few closing remarks here.
Also, the person that Bill Clinton called upon to be his pastoral counseling after the mess of Lewinsky, I could tell you things about that. And it was a painful thing for him. And he tried hard to do what was right after he did something wrong. And that's a big difference. I'll wrap this up simply by quoting some political philosophers. First of all, a historian, Beard, said something that has been borne out by the panel. He said these things: who the gods would destroy, they first make drunk with power. In a real sense, what we saw happening in the Watergate story is the president assuming more and more power that wasn't his, like the bombing in Cambodia. The second of Beard's law was this: the wheels of the gods grind slowly, but exceedingly fine. And I think we had that at Watergate. It didn't happen very quickly. I had breakfast with George McGovern 2.5 years ago and asked him about the election. And he said when the Ellisburg mess occurred, he came out with these papers from the Pentagon, and it showed that the Pentagon knew what was going on, that this war was unwinnable and people were dying unnecessarily. And he thought between that and the Watergate breaking that he was going to win. And I have to tell you that these people here were incredibly heroic, because he said the news about Watergate, the news about Ellisburg, did not move the electorate, did not motivate them to change their voting pattern. As a matter of fact, as was cited, Nixon won by one of the greatest majorities that this country has ever seen. Only carried Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. He said that I don't know what went wrong, why America did not change. And that leads me to the last theme, and this is Edmund Burke's concept. All that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men and good women to do nothing. I thank God that we had people in Congress there and then who were willing to risk their reputations and their futures by taking a stand for what was right. I hope and pray that we will see the likes of them often in Congress, and I thank them for what they did for the country, in addition to thanking them for what they did not. Thank you, and thank you.